So we take our final look at the American Revolution, the Treaty of Paris. What were the end results of this conflict, which from the start of the fighting to the signing of the treaty, we're talking 8 years. About 6 years of fighting, 8 total years. Now, when you look at this, we can make out four names. We see David Hartley, the British negotiator. He ends up signing on behalf of England. And then we see some heavy hitters. We have John Adams, Ben Franklin, and John Jay, an individual who will end up becoming the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he will have a lot of diplomatic experience. We've got the A team. That's the best way to put it. We have our best men on the job. And even thinking further down the road, John Adams is joined by his son, John Quincy Adams, that same boy who, with his mother, personally watched the Battle of Bunker Hill, is in Paris. He's abroad with his father during these negotiations. So that'll be the start of his foreign policy experience. He'll have his own successful career as a statesman, a negotiator, a president for one term, which doesn't go as well, but then a member of the House of Representatives. Now, John Jay was already in France and sent John Adams a message in late September 1782 that the British were ready to discuss a peace. Adams was in The Hague, in the Netherlands. He's negotiating a trade treaty with the Dutch. So he was able to travel pretty quickly. This also ties back to after Yorktown. Within the year, the Dutch decided to diplomatically recognize the United States. So Adams is abroad for a large portion of the war and has a huge role in that. So we got Jay in France. Adams joins him. Ben Franklin was already in Paris, but he was suffering from gout. So he was not present when John Jay began negotiations with the British in June. Now, this is the Treaty of Paris, subsequently negotiated in Paris. The three American diplomats, Adams, Jay, and Franklin, agreed that they would open and conduct their negotiations without consulting the French court, which was somewhat seen as an insult. The official negotiations lasted about a month, from late October until the last week of November. So this also explains why Washington didn't resign as general until December of 1783. Because if the treaty was not finalized until the last week of November 1783, that's how long it would take for news to cross the Atlantic. When we look at what was included, the provisions, John Jay refused to begin talks until the British recognized American independence. He refused to open it. And this is despite the fact that Congress told the representatives to abide by the wishes of the French Foreign Ministry. So Congress had already told these men, you must consult the French. They had agreed not to consult them when it came to negotiating. So that kind of tells us right off the bat that maybe our new form of national government, not necessarily that strong. So U.S. independence is acknowledged. The United States of America is recognized as a country. After acknowledging independence, Britain almost immediately agreed to the new boundaries of the nation. The British ceded all land between the Appalachian Mountains and Mississippi River, which doubles the size of the U.S. Remember that the Appalachian Mountains had been the dividing line. That proclamation of 1763 that was signed into law 2 decades ago, that sort of had been the unofficial border of the colonies. That's no more. So Florida is still Spanish. That means it's the southeastern border, but the Mississippi River is now the western border. This means that the United States now had navigation rights to the Mississippi River. This is extremely important. The Mississippi is kind of the lifeline of North America. Technically, we had rights to it, but Spain is not going to honor this in our early years, so we'll have that to contend with. Anytime you have war, there's loss of life and loss of property. So the issue of private debts related to compensation for each side for the losses they had racked up. John Jay and Ben Franklin believed that each side had debts and they should both just be canceled. But John Adams believed that the debts needed to be repaid. If we were to be legitimized as a nation and taken seriously, we would need to have to pay these back. Now, in the end, the states, the American states, would have to compensate loyalists for properties that were damaged or confiscated during the war. This is especially an issue in New York that had been loyalist territory, because once the loyalists leave, their property will be taken or destroyed. It's a mess. So the states had to pay for that. This never happens. On the flip side, England granted freedom to thousands of slaves that fled to British lines. Legally speaking, this was considered property loss for slave owners. So England agreed to compensate slave owners for their losses. That never happened. So each side agreed to it, but in the end, didn't quite pan out. Finally, when we talk about the Grand Banks, there's a reason why, if you think all the way back to our first unit, England's first attempt to set up a colony was off of what's now Newfoundland, right by the Grand Banks. The Grand Banks are in the North Atlantic off the Newfoundland coast. Fishing is big business. Adams made it a point to secure the rights of American fishermen to utilize this area. One of the weird side effects, if you look at all of the provisions, this would seem to be one that didn't matter the most. And he insisted on getting this. It almost derailed the talks, but he succeeded. Now, keep in mind, Adams is a Massachusetts man, which at that time, Massachusetts included what we now call the state of Massachusetts, but also the land that's now Maine. So getting fishing rights to the Grand Banks would have had a special place in his heart as a New Englander. So that maybe explains his insistence on it. Now, since we did not consult the French and had technically signed this separate peace with Great Britain, it did violate our alliance with the French. And also, technically, this treaty released all POWs, or prisoners of war. But Parliament had already authorized American POWs to be released over a year before that, and most British POWs had already escaped. So we got the politics out of the way. The negotiations have occurred. The treaty is signed, sealed, delivered. By European standards, this is what North America now looks like at the end of the war. Britain is in control of what's now Canada, as well as some Caribbean properties. France controls still their Caribbean properties. Russia is starting to gain a foothold in North America. They control what's now Alaska, and they're going to make their presence known along the Pacific coast. In addition to Britain to the north, Spain will continue to be the biggest threat to the United States, because recall, we now have all land east of the Mississippi. We're supposed to be able to use the Mississippi River, but Spain disputes that. This will contribute to why we're going to have a hard time using the Mississippi in our early years. But as we look at the map, in total, Britain suffered about 24,000 casualties. When we say casualties, that's killed, missing, or wounded. About 200,000 Americans served in this war. About 25,000 died. The population of De Pere. That's the equivalent of the population of De Pere died in this war on the American side. This means, when you take it in total, approximately 1% of the American population paid the ultimate sacrifice when it came to securing separation from Great Britain and the eventual creation of the United States of America.